to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 141st episode, our returning guest is Carlos Dengler. You first heard Carlos Dengler on episodes 87, 88, and 123 of the podcast. Carlos Dengler is a freelance actor, musician, writer, and filmmaker living in New York City. Carlos is completing post-production on a festival-bound short film called Iowa. He wrote, directed, and starred in the film, along with composing the score and editing. It is based on characters from Charles D'Ambrosio's short story, The Scheme of Things. He has written for N+1, 7 Stories Press, and is working with Foundry Literary Media on writing his first memoir. He performed a critically acclaimed one-person show for New York Fringe Festival in 2016 entitled Homo Sapiens Interruptus, and guest performed with the Late Night with Seth Meyers house band. Carlos worked with director Terry Kinney at Lincoln Center Theater in 2016 and performed with De Camera of Houston, portraying Marcel Proust in a devised theater piece with music in 2017. He received an MFA from NYU Grad Acting in 2015 and was the founding bass player and keyboardist for the band Interpol from 1997 to 2010. Carlos is currently developing an experimental monologue called The Importance of Earnest, loosely based on the similarly titled play by Oscar Wilde. Carlos is an avid backpacker and amateur nature photographer. He has a Flickr album full of photos from all of his adventures and a recently edited hiking video on Vimeo shot entirely on his iPhone in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. He has raised money for the Fresh Air Fund on GoFundMe through his backpacking adventures. And now on to the show. Well, hey, thanks for coming back on the podcast. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so we've got a lot to talk about here. I've seen the movie The Dirt, Motley Crue's biopic, and you wrote a pretty interesting essay about it. So, yeah, a lot to discuss. But I guess, first of all, I was just interested in your kind of first experiences listening to Motley Crue. I remember from talking to you previously that you were kind of a metalhead growing up, and that, you know, you kind of thought that this album, their debut album, kind of crossed a lot of musical boundaries as far as punk and metal and that.
It's true. I'm going to do a big confession. When I was a headbanger growing up as a teenager in the suburbs of New Jersey, and also a little bit in New York as well, in Elmhurst, Queens, I actually hated Motley Crue. They were one of the best, and because I also hated Poison. I hated hair metal. I just despised it, because what I was kind of getting into it for was much more of the kind of fantasy narrative, like the fantasy mythology aspect of it, like the kind of swords and fire-breathing dragons aspect of heavy metal, like in Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, a little bit more, and Metallica, just a little bit more serious in that level, or more like fantasy-oriented. So bands that were like singing about women and, for instance, Cherry Pie, just one of the more glaring examples of like the kind of glam metal, and there's plenty to talk about. There's plenty to unpack there, but that I hated that stuff back then. And so Motley Crue, as kind of being really the progenitors of glam metal, of hair metal, they were kind of like the first in a way. They just and they were so huge. I mean, just like you said, heavy metal, and you could either go Metallica or you could go Motley Crue. And really, there were lots of, there were camps in my community, like where I only hung out with people who didn't want to listen to that shit. And we considered that music, that variant of metal, as being a kind of like, in a way, like an olive branch to the mainstream. Like, well, this is the stuff that's on the radio that you hear on MTV. That's your idea of what heavy metal is. But actually, you don't know about this other kind of heavy metal that's the real metal that you don't hear on the radio, like Iron Maiden, Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, the thrash metal, and even some of the death. So that was sort of more like my take back then. Then I kind of gravitated in the wake of the, kind of transformation of the musical landscape with grunge music and Nirvana. Punk became kind of like the cool thing. If you were a headbanger, you really had to quickly kind of make a move and say, are you going to like double down and stick to your guns and just be like part of the kids that like are not going to let go of that? Or are you going to get with the new program, which is punk, grunge, Nirvana, a little bit more of like an alternative heavy rock aesthetic. So I started hanging out with these kids that were really into like punk hardcore, and they were listening to the first Motley Crue record, Too Fast for Love. And that I just found, these were kids that were listening to Minor Threat and Youth of Today and like just, Agnostic Front, like really super hardcore DIY hardcore punk stuff. Listening to once in a while, they're popping in that tape in the car. And it kind of legitimated. Is it legitimized or legitimated? I can't remember, but I'll go with legitimized. It legitimized Motley Crue in my eyes because these kids who like would never like be caught dead at a metal concert and eschewed all of the, idiotic kind of immature gropings towards Dungeons and Dragons and all of that imagery. They were about real stuff like mosh pits and anger and like it was more psychological. If they were listening to that first Crue record, then Crue must have been up to something. And then I think when the aughts came, we had a kind of renaissance for the, kind of a soft spot for the 80s. 90s was all about hating the 80s. So when the 80s kind of came back into fashion in the aughts, Motley Crue all of a sudden became one of the coolest bands that you could listen to. And people were going back to those records and saying, wait a second, this was an amazing band. And also look at how brilliantly they handled the idea of rock and roll spectacle. And it kind of, then I took an even deeper dive back into Crue during that time. So that's sort of, and then since then I've just basically, I love some tracks from Theater of Pain, but it's really about those first two records. Girls also has a couple great tracks on there as well. But I mean, you really can't get much better than that first album, in my opinion. That's my Motley Crue story, Rob.
Okay, all right. Well, good. Well, I mean, I'm just thinking to what growing up my parents would have thought about me listening to Motley Crue, and you say that in the metal community they were kind of seen as too soft or mainstream, but I'm sure my parents would have seen, the satanic imagery and the music videos, and they would have just thrown it all in the same bucket and say, "Oh, this is terrible."
Yeah. But here's the thing: we're forgetting that back in the 80s, before the internet, you couldn't, if you'd missed a band's music videos or album when that album came out, you basically didn't see that music video ever again until like there was some kind of throwback show or like a history of that band, like a documentary or something. Like that video was sort of like lost to the nothing of history because with the internet, which kind of globalizes all of history, and all of history is now all of a sudden accessible. We didn't have that. We were kind of stuck in our year. So by the time I was actually sort of listening to when I was getting into metal, it was about 87. It was kind of on the later stage of that process for heavy metal. And that was the year that Girls, Girls, Girls came out. And if you look at the iconography on that record, it's not that satanic stuff. That was like Nikki Sixx was kind of like David Bowie in the sense of each album had a theme and he kind of had a concept for each one. Shout out to that, Satanism was sort of like the sort of blanket topic he was kind of going for on that second record. But I mean, they never were really, they used a bit of satanic imagery in that music video, but then they quickly moved on. In Theater of Pain, they quickly moved on to other, forms. And then by Girls, 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 they're just kind of like this motorcycle band in a way. They're not really even doing anything So by that point, they just looked like these, super slick dudes that I just despised. Also, Tommy Lee was a lot more in the news back then because of his marriages. But then
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, well, these guys are just like tabloid monster. Like the kind of bands that I listen to are serious, are talking about serious stuff, like Metallica. Metallica was kind of
Mm-hmm.
sort of just concepts like justice and famine and sickness
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. So that was sort of where I was going for stuff that couldn't make it into the mainstream back then, and Crew seemed to be, and I talk a little bit about this in the piece. They seemed to kind of they very adroitly handled the whole PR aspect of their group while being a good band at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think the songs hold up. I mean, if you go back and listen to, like you said, those, especially those early songs, musically they definitely hold up. And I think that there is something to be said for the bass player Nikki Sixx being the main songwriter and kind of driving force because those bass lines are so iconic. It's just amazing how they've kind of endured the test of time.
To me, he was always the coolest one in the band. I actually got to meet him very briefly in like the mid-aughts after reading
Mm.
The Dirt, and they were playing the main stage at a festival that Interpol was playing the side stage of, and
Uh-huh.
I made a request with our publicity person, and she was like, "Let me get cracking on that," and she came back like 20 minutes later, and she says, "I think it's a go. Come with me," and I was like, "No fucking way!" And so we walked over to his tent and we talked for like 5 minutes, and I even have a picture of it. I have to, it's on my, it was taken on my disposable camera, so I have to dig it up out of the shoebox. But and I told him how real I thought he was in The Dirt. I found his chapters to be the most intelligent, compelling, and I mean, even if you don't look at him now, but listen to him. He if you were to hear him talk right now and you weren't watching video of him, you would think that you were talking to somebody that, could appear on this show, for instance.
Hmm.
He's very articulate and
Hmm.
very, very intelligent. I really wonder what's going through his mind, like how he thinks about all of this.
Hmm. Well, like you said, like a lot of the imagery is so over the top that it's kind of easy to dismiss if you just kind of look at it initially. But obviously, there's a lot of, thought and, work that went into creating these various images. And, that does take a lot of planning and kind of background intelligence that you might not think of if you just kind of look at, who are these goofballs.
Of course. No, there's a lot of intelligent design behind the entire package of that
Hmm.
group. And I think they're one of those rare bands that you see, some bands that there are too much spectacle, not enough music, and then a lot of bands are too much music and not enough spectacle, and there are problems with both of those balances. I feel like they were one of the ones that really hit the best balance between you could theoretically say I love Motley Crue, but I just don't ever want to look at them, and I don't ever want to go to a Motley Crue show. Not that you can't anymore because they're not a band anymore, but
Hmm.
those
Yeah.
songs are good enough that you could just be like, I just want to listen to them, and then you could be somebody that just kind of loves the whole mystique of camp metal from the 80s and hair metal and not really be paying too much attention to the music, and that they would offer you a lot as well if you were that person.
Hmm. Well, we've talked a little bit about the book of the Dirt, but I think it's an interesting concept because it's a collaborative biography, kind of written by each member of the band contributes a section, right? That's kind of how it's
Yeah,
structured,
yeah.
right? So that kind of seems like it gives a pretty good cross section as opposed to hearing just one person's voice of the experiences. So.
Yeah, that's what makes the book so worth the read.
Hmm.
Like I write in the piece, there's it does have a certain kind of cachet and a reputation, which depending on how you slice it, may or may not be deserved. But I think it's just one of those books that really, it's you kind of you show up for something and then you stay for something else. It's one of those where you kind of you're like, oh, I picked this book up because I just wanted to see what was, what it was like, and you get that, but then you quickly kind of move past that because it takes you so deep into their story. And a lot of that has to do with Neil Strauss, who edited it. An excellent journalist. He's done other work. He's another guy that I met very briefly. We hung out at a festival watching bands and kind of walked around before I knew that he was the guy who had done The Dirt, and he made mention of it when he was hanging out, which I thought was rather modest of him. But he really did an expert job in kind of creating a narrative just from eliciting what he needed to elicit from the group. I imagine that he, met with them frequently and asked them to write about certain things and probably coached them in terms of like going into stuff. Maybe they would submit drafts and it didn't contain enough material about so and so topic, and he probably said, "Hey, we need to hear more about this." There's a lot there. His sort of invisible hand is very, very noticeable to at least to someone who's looking at it from a more kind of writerly perspective, as some of us are.
For sure. Now, you read the book first and then you saw the movie, and
Well, I read the book in like 04 or 05 or something like that.
Okay.
So,
a long time ago.
I still have my copy, but it's dog-eared and it's been a long time. I actually read it while I was on tour. And then yes, saw that the movie came out.
Right. Yeah, I always feel like if you read the book first, you're almost bound to be disappointed by the movie. I can only think of a few examples of a time when I've seen the movie and thought it was better than the book.
The Shining?
Oh, well, yeah, you might be right. Yeah, I could see that.
I've read The Shining, but I've heard that Stephen King was rather displeased with Stanley Kubrick's take on his book, and one can only imagine is that Stanley Kubrick must have kind of improved the book because that Shining is such a work of art, in my opinion.
Right. Well, I think his from what I can remember, his complaint was that it makes him look crazy from the beginning, and it's not like you see the guy go crazy over the course of the story. So, but I mean, I think they're both great, so I don't have a problem. I think that is a good example, though, The Shining. But
it's a rare one,
for sure. But going to the concept of a biopic, I think it's interesting that the band was also the producers of the movie. And I think it's hard to get a distance on a story if you're involved in the creation of it, like if you're the subject and the storyteller. So I feel like that's an inherent problem with, not just this movie. I felt like you mentioned in your piece, Bohemian Rhapsody had a lot of problems too, and that was also, I think, co-produced by Brian May and maybe someone else from Queen. But anyway, anytime it seems like you're playing both roles, it seems like there's no way you can be totally objective about yourself.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. I don't know if you've seen the infamous band meeting with the manager scene in Bohemian Rhapsody. Do you know the scene I'm talking about?
Describe it a little bit. I've seen it.
They're essentially sitting at a table outside, and this manager comes in and starts schooling them.
Oh, yes.
And it's kind of gone viral on the internet as an example of the absolutely atrocious editing in that movie, which is quite ironic because the movie won an Oscar for editing, and it's actually quite the opposite of an Oscar deserving movie. It is literally one of the most atrociously edited movies, and if you watch this scene, you will see what people mean. And it's also a direct example of the problems of having, let's say, a band like Queen oversee the production, because the reason why that scene is so poorly edited is because the camera is constantly cutting to shots of every single band member, just giving equal weight. And so you have no sense of what's driving the scene or who the main character is. There's no understanding of the narrative drive of that scene, and I can only imagine that it's a similar case for the entire film. And I think right there is an example of the prejudice and the bias that probably corrupts the narrative drive in a movie when you have people who've dedicated their entire lives to this trademark or this brand that you could call Queen. And so they naturally feel a sense of ownership and control over it. And of course, anybody who's going to work on this project is going to be very deferential to them because they're the people who fathered the whole idea in the first place. So who's going to want to contradict Brian May when he complains that there's not enough of a shot of the bass player or something like that? The director's not going to intervene, right? The director's not going to piss off Brian May, right? And that's sort of, I think, an example of the problem where you're trying to create a movie and instead it becomes fan service and it's not really a movie. And so then the movie is really bad and then it makes you think less of the band, ironically enough.
But yeah, I totally agree. And I just feel like that's a problem with a lot of these biopics. And you used the term brand pornography. Do you want to explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I used that in the piece that I wrote. And I think, Bohemian Rhapsody is a good example of brand pornography. The movie, the dramatization on Netflix of The Dirt, I think is a pretty stellar example of brand pornography. And I just mean, what I mean by brand pornography is just when a certain bit of media or a product or, something that could be called a work of art on a certain level, insofar as, let's say, a movie can be construed as a work of art. Not every movie is a work of art, obviously, but some are. That instead of that the true function of that thing, instead of it being a movie, it's to actually titillate the sort of adjacent desires of a certain consumer base of a certain pre-existing product. So it's like merchandise, I think, is a great example of brand pornography. And with merchandise, I feel like it's a little bit less of a guilty. I think there's less fault to place there, because if you're, let's say, with a rock, you have like a rock T-shirt. Like, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with a rock T-shirt. You're sort of communicating when you buy it and when you wear it, you're communicating to the world that you belong to a certain tribe, and that's an important message to kind of tell the world if being part of that community or being part of that tribe is very important to you. And so that kind of becomes an extension of the kind of ethos that's behind the making of the album or the band or the forming of the band or the live show in the first place. So that feels organic to me. But then, let's take Kiss as an example, who are probably the most notorious brand pornographers that ever were, and quite unabashedly, without any kind of shame, have peddled their brand for decades now. I mean, Gene Simmons, I think, has been very clear about his intentions in that regard. And so they create action figures, they create comic books, they create all sorts of crazy things that really have nothing to do with the music. And in the case with a band like Kiss, they were already formed so much on the back of a concept, right? That they make good music. I'm not going to say that Kiss is a bad band. They certainly have some really, really fantastic material, but so much of the identity of the brand known as Kiss, let's call them a brand instead of a band, is that this idea, this concept, which lends itself very readily to kind of a diasporal notion of merchandising, where you can say we can create coffee coasters, we can create beer mugs, we can create all sorts of anything, and people will buy it, and they'll be participating in the brand, even though they're not listening to the music, which is apparently, ostensibly, supposed to be the sort of thing that Kiss is, right? They are a band, right? But they're really more than just a band, right? So that's like an example. And I think that with the realm of a biopic, it is very, very easy for that, and I think it happens most of the time, that endeavor turns into brand pornography, and that it becomes another adjacent kind of consumer product of that brand. And so you go and you don't care whether it's a bad movie or not, do you? If you're a Queen fan, you go to see Bohemian Rhapsody, and maybe it's the first movie you've gone to in a year because you don't watch movies, but you go to this, right? So you're not really going to see the movie now, are you? Right? You are going to participate in the band's merchandising. So my problem with that, and that's why I call it pornography. I mean, I believe pornography should exist, so I'm not necessarily placing too much of a value on pornography. But if we define pornography as just simply putting forward the sort of dopamine hit that you're getting from whatever it is that you're devouring. So most of the time, what we understand pornography to be is sexually titillating material. So that's why we're watching that video, is to get sexually titillated by that. So it's not about watching the video, right? When you watch pornography online, or if it's the 80s when you go into the movies. So that's why I call it pornography, because you're going to it on the basis of an ostensible cause, but actually what you're really participating in is some kind of ulterior or clandestine product, which is, in the case of Bohemian Rhapsody, or in the case of The Dirt, participation in the sort of adjacent manifestations of that brand. So if you're a director or a producer or something, and you want to do something that's kind of imaginative, or if you want to explore, or if you want to interrogate the notion of Queen or the notion of Motley Crue, and you are having Brian May or Nikki Sixx on staff in the writer's room, how are you going to properly conduct that interrogation when you've got the guy who's in charge, who started the whole brand, telling you what is written in the Bible of that brand and what is not? So in order to properly interrogate it, you're going to have to construe the Bible of that brand as being just one item among many other items to consider for creating a biopic. But you won't be allowed to do that, right? Because the overseer of the brand protector will be there to contravene upon that. I think one of the greatest examples, which is actually a movie I have not seen and it's on the docket and I definitely need to see it, is the Bob Dylan.
I was going to bring that up, actually. Yeah.
That is a perfect example of how, and I mean that, maybe abstract sort of, post-structuralist thought within cinema is not your bag, but and so you might not like that movie based on its sort of aesthetic treatment of the Bob Dylan phenomenon. Say what you will about the aesthetics, one cannot deny that movie is a very incisive interrogation of what we understand the notion of Bob Dylan to be, right? When we go to that movie, we are not engaging in Bob Dylan brand pornography, because I don't think even that just shows you how legitimate of an artist Bob Dylan actually is, because the notion of brand pornography for Bob Dylan it's difficult to kind of come up. You could say, oh, okay, he's an American folk guitarist or something. That doesn't really kind of adhere too well to Bob Dylan. He's so much more sophisticated than that. So of course, the biopic is going to be similarly sophisticated in that regard. And his, I think, I don't know how much involvement he had in it, but it is, in my opinion, a really good example of a successful interrogation of the symbol that is Bob Dylan. And I don't think you have to be a Bob Dylan in order to do that. Like I say in the piece, you could watch Glow, and when Glow, the gorgeous ladies of wrestling, came out in the 80s, I don't think anyone really took them all that seriously back then. I mean, they took them as seriously as you can take as seriously as you can take professional wrestling, I'm sure. Certainly in hindsight, they look looks very campy and very kind of part of the 80s, right? So we're not dealing with like a Bob kind of level of depth in terms of the imagery, but that show is fantastic. That show is a really great show because it interrogates the notion of Glow. So my disappointment around the dirt
Mm-hmm.
that there was this kind of real absence of interrogation about the Motley Crue phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I haven't even read The Dirt. I just watched the Behind the Music episode on VH1 back when I was in high school, so I already knew a lot of those kind of main points, like Ozzy snorting the ants and the thing about him shooting up and then dying and then shooting up again. Like I knew the main beats, and I think like you're saying, if people go to a movie like that, they want to see those things. It's like, hey, when are we gonna see Queen at Live Aid? I want to see Queen at Live Aid. I'm at the Queen movie, you know. And it's like, got to
Exactly.
check the boxes, you know, for the people that came to see that one thing. And it's like, I've already seen Queen at Live Aid. I don't need to see your subpar, you know,
Exactly.
recreation of it, you know.
But if you're not really thinking, you do want to see that because you're just drunk on Queen, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're just like, I can't. I feel like I'm at a Queen concert. Oh, even though it doesn't matter. Oh, look at them go. Look at them talk.
Yeah.
It's so base. It's not really. It's not
Mm-hmm.
really. It's not really a higher engagement with the material.
Mm-hmm.
It's some people. I've spoken with my girlfriend about this. Who, there's some people that we know that are also fans of metal and of Crew in particular, who don't share my desire to see something with a bit more depth in terms of this kind of secondary coverage of a brand. And the reason that they give is that, well, Motley Crue was was campy to begin with. So why would the movie be good? They were never supposed to be serious, so why should the movie be serious? Which actually doesn't that's a false equivalence in my opinion, because actually the phenomenon of Motley Crue was serious, not like in the digestion of it. I mean, obviously the imagery isn't serious on that level, but what they accomplished
Mm-hmm.
was a very serious thing, in the same way that what John Waters accomplished with his movies is a serious thing, even though the movies themselves are what you would call trash cinema, but they function on the level
Mm-hmm.
of art because of how uh, sort of consistent the methodology is, because of the groundbreaking nature, because of the daring, because of the courage. All of that can be applied to Motley Crue. So the actual form of the original art form was fantastic to begin. It was high art on insofar as you can look at camp as high art. So to say that
Mm-hmm.
the movie then does not have to be good is a total false equivalence. In fact, if anything, it asks the movie to be better than your average movie because it's covering something that was an important contribution to the larger cultural ecosphere.
Mm-hmm. Well, you speak of camp, and one of the most campy biopics I remember seeing was Great Balls of Fire, the Jerry Lee Lewis one
Mm,
with Randy
yeah,
Quaid as,
yeah,
yeah, that was like a live action cartoon, but it was interesting because he's kind of the center of what he did. Is infamous for is pretty gross. Marrying his I think 13-year-old cousin.
yeah,
And it's like it almost seems like they had to be that campy just to get you to digest the
yeah.
facts of the case. You know what I mean? So.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean that movie, like, that movie came out at a time when we as a society were not ready to truly look at those problems, let's say, right? I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know if you've seen the Michael Jackson documentary.
Oh, I have. Oh my gosh, I can't
Yeah.
even listen to Michael Jackson anymore after seeing that. It's
It's
terrible.
tough, right? Yeah. I mean, it really kind of, there's been some great talk subsequent to that. There's a great podcast, Still Processing,
Hmm.
the name of the podcast, and they did a special on it, like how can we possibly cancel Michael Jackson?
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah,
It's too
but
it's too deep.
they're really wrestling with his legacy and now with the addition of that documentary. But
Mhm.
one of the most damning aspects, and you can tell me if you agree with me or not, about that documentary is how they are showing this footage of Michael walking around with kids in plain sight,
Mhm.
holding hands, holding arms together,
Yeah.
frolicking around. and this was not footage that we needed to dig up. It was like an ABC News profile or something else from the 80s and the 90s, and we look at each other and say, wait, I was there, I watched that, like when it came out, and I didn't say anything. None of us said anything. This goes to show how like society truly is an organism in that respect, and we're not going to be ready to investigate certain things until we are. I think if a Jerry Lee Lewis movie came out, if that movie came out today, if Great Balls of Fire came out today, there would be an absolute brouhaha, and a deservedly one, if that movie tackled the issue of that kind of age gap in the same kind of cavalier way that it did in the original, right? I mean, it would just it wouldn't fly, and deservedly so. It wouldn't fly. I think it is the responsibility of the filmmaker to address that topic.
Well, and yeah, when and I accepted the same excuses that I think everyone else did of Michael Jackson at the time. You know, he didn't have a childhood. You know, he's had his childhood stolen, and that's why he does this. And now I'm like looking back, and I'm like, well, so what? A lot of people didn't have a childhood. Does that make this okay? I don't think so. Like, I'm not letting my kids sleep with this guy. You know?
Yes.
Like, just because he didn't have a childhood, that's not an excuse. So.
It's also quite a quite a damning portrait of fame and celebrity as well. I think because when you just the family wrestling with the decisions that they made to allow this to happen under their noses, I think that's one of the best parts of the film, is that they're actually also interviewing the parents, and they're going back and really reviewing like when they let certain things happen and how just utterly enthralled they were by this creature known as Michael Jackson. That, if anyone else would have asked, hey, can your kid sleep in my bed? They would have called the police, but because it was Michael Jackson,
Right, exactly.
Kind of like when you read these accounts of old corrupt popes from the Middle Ages, where they, in order to gain entrance into heaven, they would request, night with your daughter and things like that. There's lots of, and we kind of look at them and say, how could that ever happen? And then, well, it just did happen, actually. Except the royalty, the kind of royal persona now is no longer this sort of father of the church and connection to God, but it's this other version of it, which is sort of the pop cultural hero and icon that Michael Jackson was.
Well, and you talk a little bit about this in the piece, because the movie, and I'm sure the book too, shows the band doing some pretty despicable things, beating women, obviously mistreating women in other ways. Vince Neil drunkenly drives around and kills his friend. That's pretty inexcusable. There's just all these things, and I guess that we all know about them, so they're kind of undeniable. But when we look at them, they're not really. The movie at least doesn't seem to examine this. It just is like, well, that happened. I don't know. It doesn't seem to have much curiosity about, oh, is this wrong or right, or anything else. But what was your take on that part of it?
Exactly. It's another box to check now, isn't it? In the movies.
Yeah, right.
It's like, oh, we got to hit those marks, There's a great, I want to plug it. There's a great YouTube video, perhaps you know about it. It's called The Broken Formula of Music Biopics. It dropped 2 months ago, and I think it probably dropped in the wake of the Bohemian Rhapsody movie. It's gotten like close to 350,000 views already. It's about half an hour long, and I highly recommend any listeners to watch it, because it's a very, very adroit analysis of one of the big reasons why music biopics are so utterly formulaic, vapid, superficial, and disposable. His main reason for this is that because it's similar to my brand pornography idea, which is just that they are trying to tell too big of a story. They're trying to tell an entire epic history. You can't really do that in an hour and a half or 2 hour format. It's just not possible. So they're unfocused. They always go to the same formula of rise, stardom, and then fall, then addiction, depravity, fall, but then like a a redemption at the end. This is the same arc that you see through all of them, and they obey that arc. There just isn't anything else. There's no. That's just sort of like the only thing that they can think, because it's the only way to tackle the epic sweep of the entire brand. You could say from the small. We got to start where the band formed. We got to like finish where they're like on top again as older, wizened, men. And so, I think that's probably what they were doing in terms of the Dirt, 2019 Netflix, is they were basically, not really hitting those notes with any kind of real examination, because they were just sort of taking it as a matter of course that this is kind of where the story has to sort of pass through these events. So let's pass through them and get to the ending. But you're right. There's no curiosity about there's no curiosity at all in that film. The film is just it's a parade. It's a Motley Crue parade. It's not a Motley Crue biopic. It's actually a Motley Crue parade. And it is insulting, during a lot of those parts, especially in 2019. I think I also saw another piece online. This is print. Is that could a band like Motley Crue come out today? And it was really good in the sense of, showcasing here are the 5 reasons why a band like Motley Crue could not come out today. And if you really think about what they became known for, that sort of kind of heteronormative understanding of male desire was part and parcel of the national discourse in 1980s America. But certainly now, in the wake of Me Too, we don't have access to that kind of naivete any longer. We already know too much now. So for a movie to almost quite deliberately, with, let's say, in my piece, I used the most glaring example to me was that they just sort of showed these women coming out of dining room tables, working and looking like they were so satisfied with this chance to give fellatio to one of the guys from Motley Crue. It's not that didn't happen. Yes, that did happen. But to just simply kind of tout it and include it because it's in the memoir, and if in a way with a wink and a nod, like with like kind of like a wink wink nudge nudge, like isn't that cool? Glorifying, right? It's inexcusable in 2019. It's inexcusable. And I mean, I don't know. I feel quite certain, Rob, that I'm in the minority of Motley Crue fans that are as aghast as I am about this film. But, obviously, whatever. It's just a movie, and we can move on, and it's just a band, so we can move on. But for me, the reason why I find it so troublesome is that because, well, obviously, I have my own biographical reasons for that as well. Because I, too, was in a band, and I, too, was one of those kinds of guys, and certainly in my memoir there will be some fairly lengthy atoning for that, not in like an excruciating kind of way, or like a please whip my back, I was so bad, mea culpa kind of way, but in a way that I'm going to endeavor to kind of face up to the idea that I too participated in this very antiquated heteronormative understanding of male desire, which I think the whole notion of a rock band is somewhat founded on. And I think that we as a culture need to examine that and stop telling stories about a bunch of white dudes getting together to start having sex with women. That's just, it's not really a cool story anymore now, is it? I mean, look who we have as our president, right? It's time to get serious about what stories we're actually telling ourselves. And for me, the reason why I had such a problem with that film is that it is kind of part of the problem, if you will.
Right. Well, that was kind of be my next question, is because obviously you're kind of reflecting on your own experiences, and you are writing something that could potentially, I don't know what your plans for it would be, but I mean, it could be a biopic. You could have a biopic of yourself. How does that color how you watch a movie like this?
It colors it greatly.
Yeah, I'm
Colors
sure.
of gray, colors of gray and black. No, uh, I'm still working on, how what kind of goes into the contract. Obviously, it's very early, and I'm still shopping it around and talking with people. So, but obviously, I have thought about, like, well, how do I want to approach the issue about film rights and all of that sort of stuff? And I'm not in control of any other stories that are going to seek to be told about me if those happen, about my old band or my old time in the music industry. And that's frustrating to me because I don't have I'm not optimistic about the quality of what that endeavor would be. From what I understand about how people are regarding the music that was created and the scene that we were part of, it's not really coming from an elevated place. It's coming from a similarly kind of debasing kind of place that, let's say, this Netflix Dirt movie is. That's my kind of, like, so much more has to happen before I can definitively come down about that. But that's just sort of my impression about what the discourse is around that time. It's just not something it's not a way of engaging with that material that I'm interested in. So, in terms of, biographical, from my own memoir, obviously I'm going to seek to retain as much control over that material as I can to make sure that if and when it would ever come time to kind of hand over the reins of that to, that it would be a good director and it would be a good, and then I would have to take myself out of that because, again, I don't want to be part of the problem in the way that, let's say Brian May was probably part of the problem in Bohemian Rhapsody. But yeah, that's something that might happen. The memoir is being written as like a collection of stories and essays, so it's not going to be written in a chronological order. I think that would lend itself to a successful dramatization because then, if someone were to be interested in creating a film out of one of those chapters, you could just take that chapter and then that could work as a film. You can make a short story into a working movie. It's taking a whole novel or a whole memoir and turning that into a movie that I don't find to be a reasonable endeavor. And documentaries aren't immune either. I mean, Some Kind of Monster by Metallica it's still a great documentary, I think. But
it is.
if you go back and watch it, you can see that the band is sort of also polishing their image in that documentary as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That was actually a really good one. I did like the psychiatrist that like kind of tries to sidle his way into joining the band. I thought that was an interesting part of that movie.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, biopics are interesting because I kind of have some removed from it, so I can kind of view it more as just entertainment. One of my favorite ones isn't actually a real biopic; it's a satire of it. It's Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story with John C. Reilly.
Oh my God. He covered the YouTube video that I plugged earlier.
Oh, good. Okay.
About what's wrong with biopics. He includes there's a lengthy part in there where he kind of takes a deep dive into that satire.
Yeah.
And it made me really want to watch it. I didn't even know that it existed.
Oh, yeah, so good.
Yeah, I gotta check that out.
Oh, definitely, and it hits all the points too. Like you said, there's like a formula to it. It came out right after the Johnny Cash and Ray Charles movies that are like almost identical. So it's like one of the siblings dies, and then it's like the wrong kid died, and it's like it just hits every single beat. So.
Oh my God, it's laughable. It's absolutely laughable.
Definitely. But yeah, I think it's interesting how, there's truth and there's kind of what we perceive as the truth, and there's a lot of things that they fudge on that I guess we're okay with, like in the Queen documentary, the biopic. They kind of present the Live Aid thing as like, oh, the band's got to get the band back together, but it's like in reality the band wasn't even apart, but it's like it's so married to the idea of that formula that it has to even twist the truth that's like demonstrably false, because this is a real thing that happened. This isn't a fictional story. This is about an actual band, and we know, just look at their discography, they were still producing albums right up into that and through that. And it's not like it was like they had to get the band back together. It just was a big concert for them, and they continued on their merry way, you know. So it's like they have to like wedge the truth into this like formula that, you know, is just has to be, I guess. So.
Well, does it have to be? I mean, I think it has to be only insofar as late capitalism says that it has to be, right?
That's true.
We understand the brand as Queen as being this kind of cultural given that cannot be thwarted. That we cannot investigate, because if we do, I mean, look at the pushback against the two gentlemen that came out on the documentary. You know, they're getting death threats. Why are they getting death threats for coming out and talk? You know, why aren't these fans of Michael Jackson free to just simply disbelieve them silently and then just go on, you know, on their merry way being a Michael Jackson fan? But no, they feel that their entire identity has been attacked because they have merged with Michael Jackson in that, and that's how that's the power of stardom in late capitalism, right? So you'll have a director working on that biopic. I can't even imagine what the immense pressure must be on that individual to create a certain. There's probably so much on the line. Right? So you're going to have to make Live Aid be this fantastical thing that supports the kind of lowest common denominator understanding of the Queen mythology, which is that this was a victorious show. But the truth is so much more complex. It's so much more layered. And what I yearn for is a discourse on that, on taking our most kind of sacred art objects that have been so successful, bands that have sold so many albums, actors that have been in so many movies, politicians that have won so many elections, whatever the success story is. But I seek to investigate. I seek to hear the story within the story that we don't know about, because there always will be. There always will be a story. You can believe that because that's the human way, right? Humanity is complex. We are complex beings. It's capitalism that flattens us, that says, no, we're not. Actually, it can be just as simple as Queen is really cool and Live Aid was one of the greatest shows ever. Like, and we can't go farther than that. And I say, bullshit. That's what I say. You know what I think would be one of the greatest biopics, but here's the problem. This is why so many biopics are so bad. So you in order to tell this kind of a story successfully, you need a world-class film director like Scorsese or like Kubrick, who is no longer with us, but pick any other really great director to tell this story. I say, go and find somebody that tried really hard to be in a successful band and tried for decades and finally gave up because they went nowhere and then decided to go and do this other thing. You better believe there's a rise and fall. There are huge stakes in that story. There's like compelling human drama in that story. You may not have never heard of whoever that person is because they never actually made it, but there is some story to be told there. And if you get the right person, if you get talented enough people to do that, that's a movie that I want to see. Now, the problem with the biopics is that people get lazy. They say, well, the story's already there because this band already made it or this person already made it. So we don't have to like actually work too hard to tell the story. But that I think that's bullshit as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point too. Yeah, and I almost think to have a really good biopic, it almost has to be a fictionalized thing. Because one of my favorite movies is Boogie Nights, and that is about a real guy who I don't remember the name of.
I had no idea. There actually was a Dirk Diggler.
Yeah, they made a documentary about him too, no, it was a different movie. It was about the actual guy. I forget. It was like but it's loosely fictionalized, and it's able to tell the spirit of that story as opposed to now we have to do this part, now we have to do this part.
Exactly.
But like I feel like I got the like world that it was trying to tell me about without it having to be like about this one particular guy. So I don't know, it almost seems like you have to do that kind of thing. I maybe you don't. Maybe there's a way to do it, but I don't know. That frees you up a little bit if you're not, trying to hit every note. So
I think also the Bob Dylan biopic is a good example of that, because so much of that is very interpretive,
mm-hmm.
and it works, I think, on that level. What was something that was observed about Herzog? The director Werner Herzog.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of my favorites too. And I never really thought about this, but this also, it's pertinent to this discussion. If you look at his documentaries, they're all very kind of staged on purpose. He has the real people that he's interviewing, like create mock scenes. Like, for instance, in Grizzly Man, he kind of created a mock scene with almost like he was using them as actors in a way. So he turns his documentaries into fictionalized or quasi-fictionalized films. But then if you look at his actual fictional movies, he treats them like they're documentaries. He has his actors try to be as real as possible, and the way that he films everything is like absolutely brutally weird, real as possible. And I think the thesis that he's making as an artist is he's saying, the truth is actually, the greater truth is actually not in the factual story, but in there's a deeper truth underneath it. And I'm not, there's a lot of talk today in society about fake news and all that crap, which, that's not what I'm talking. I just want to be clear about that. This is not a plug for saying, oh, the truth is relative. And no, the truth is, the facts are the facts. Facts are still absolutely, totally important. But there is a truth that can be told about a person's life, let's say, if you fictionalize it, that could be a deeper, more truer truth, you could say, than the one that, carefully observes the actual factual verisimilitude of that person's life in that.
Well, that's why Hunter S. Thompson's always been one of my favorite writers, because even though he was a great journalist on his own, when he did his more fantastical things like Fear and Loathing and all that stuff, it's not literally true. There weren't literally lizards in the lounge or whatever at the casino, but like, when he goes off onto these tangents, you get the feeling, and I actually get more of a feeling of, what was happening than somebody who just said this, that, and the third. So.
Absolutely.
But, well, we're getting close to an hour here, but I did have one last question for you. Who, if you could pick any actor to star as yourself in the movie of your life, who would it be?
I would pick me, because I'm an actor too. I mean,
so you could star as yourself, I guess.
I'm being coy, but hey, wouldn't that be? Have you seen the Slavoj Žižek documentary where he kind of goes off on lectures, but he's dressed, so he'll go on and expound about like cinema theory, let's say, and if he tackles Taxi Driver, all of a sudden he's dressed like Travis Bickle, and he's in a carefully recreated set off of Taxi Driver. I can't remember what the name of this. It is fucking brilliant, and it just works so well. It's just unbelievable how well this film works. So I might be interested in doing a kind of postmodern interpretation of my youth as an old man playing myself as a 15-year-old guy, or as a 20-year-old guy, or as a 25-year-old guy. Let's not challenge me on this, Rob.
But yeah, no, that would be pretty interesting if you did that. I guess you'd have to. You said you haven't played the bass in a while. I guess you'd have to start practicing again to get your chops back up.
Well, the great thing about acting is you can look like you are doing something when you're not really doing it.
Just hold your hands in generally the right place, I guess. Cool. Well, hey, thanks for taking the time, and I hope to read more of your essays here. And did you want to plug your
thank you so much
website and all that?
Yeah. You go to carlosdengler.com and you click on blog, you'll be able to see my writings, and the Motley Crue piece is right there. I'm sure you're going to include a link in your podcast episode page for this as well.
Yep.
I appreciate any feedback on this. And I really, Rob, I thank you so much for taking an interest in this writing and in this topic. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you about it.
Yeah, you too, anytime. But I look forward to reading more of your stuff. And yeah, you're welcome back on the show anytime. So
great. Looking forward to it.
Cool. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day here.
You as well, Rob. Take care.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways to support it. Join the Rob Burgess Show mailing list. Go to tinyletter.com/The Rob Burgess Show and type in your email address. Then respond to the automatic message. I have a Patreon account which can be found at patreon.com/Rob Burgess Show Patreon. I hope you'll consider supporting in any amount. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review everywhere the podcast is available, including iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Facebook, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, and RSS. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgessshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. And if you have something to say, record a voice memo on your smartphone and send it to therobburgessshow@gmail.com. Include voice memo in the subject line of the email. Until next time.